All right, everyone. Welcome to our asynchronous lesson. So today we're going to be covering the War of 1812. I'm going to share these slides with you. You are in U.S. History class, and I'm Mrs. Richardson. Obviously this lesson is being recorded as per usual. So for today, we're going to be covering the First Barbary War and the War of 1812 between the British and the United States. So we're going to kind of look at the tensions between the United States, the British, and the French. So this is designed to come after the partisan politics lesson. So let's get started. Okay, so you may or may not have heard of the Barbary Wars, but they were a series of wars that occurred basically in the sea. And here's kind of the summary of this. So the Ottoman Turks had control of the Barbary states and were eager to gain wealth, and many ships headed through the Mediterranean were easy targets for them and easy money. So in the United States, it's 1784 to begin with, and Congress has appointed Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin as peace commissioners to negotiate treaties with various parts of Europe and the Mediterranean, including the Barbary states. So this is a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and he said, "Our trade to Portugal, Spain, and the Mediterranean is annihilated unless we do something decisive. Tribute or war is the usual alternative of these pirates. If we yield the former, it will require sums which our people will feel. Why not begin a navy then and decide on war? We cannot begin in a better cause nor against a weaker foe." So Thomas Jefferson was convinced that going to war against the Barbary pirates was the best solution and was less expensive than paying them the tribute that they wanted. And so this is sort of the first kind of war that the United States fought. And you'll see on the right here, there's a map of Europe and the Mediterranean Sea. So you can kind of see we're talking in between Europe and Africa. And, you've got American merchant ships transporting goods back and forth here, and they're being attacked by Barbary pirates. Hence, the little skull and crossbone flags can kind of show you where the Barbary pirates often were known to attack. So Thomas Jefferson is arguing that the United States should build its first navy. Now, the Barbary Wars continued for quite some time. So in 1797, Adams declared peaceful relations and agreed to pay tributes to these pirates. Many European countries had been doing the same, and the tributes were paid yearly. In 1801, however, after Thomas Jefferson becomes president, the Barbary pirates demanded $225,000 from the new United States administration, which is the equivalent to over $3.2 million in modern day money. And Tripoli also declared war on the United States, but didn't send formal news of a declaration. So Thomas Jefferson is the one whose quote we just read before, and he believed that it was better to go to war than pay tribute to these pirates, to the tune of, what would today be over $3 million. So the First Barbary War set the precedent or the example that military force could be used even without officially declaring war. Thomas Jefferson felt that it was constitutional, or that, it was approved or would be okay via national law to give orders so that the Navy was able to protect ships and soldiers against pirate aggression. The United States Congress agreed to his terms because they believed it was most important to protect. And then if confronted, war would be justified. So they sort of went into this thinking, we're going to be on the defense, and then if we get attacked, we will attack back. So in the beginning of Baby America and establishing a new government and all of the various transitions of power and the development of political parties that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks, we also had pirates attacking American ships, and America had to figure out how they were going to deal with that. So United States Navy ships were ordered to block Barbary ports. Thomas Jefferson pressed the issue as the pirates steered clear of the American Navy, but still seized property and people from merchant ships if the Navy wasn't around to protect them. This continued through 1803, 1804, 1805, and in 1805, Tripoli negotiated peace due to a change in family leadership. The leader of Tripoli ended up asking for $6,000 in ransom, and so there was this back and forth between them and American. Thomas Jefferson felt that $60,000 was an acceptable price to pay for American lives, paid the ransom, Americans were returned, and the war was finally over. So this went on for close to 10 years, this kind of off and on continued conflict with the Barbary pirates. And Tripoli, when I'm referring to Tripoli, that's sort of the hub of the Barbary pirates. So Tripoli initiated the peace due to a change in family leadership. So that's how we started to get the development of the American Navy. And then when we start talking about the War of 1812, you'll see we really had to speedily develop a navy. All right. So I just want to put an aside in here about Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton around the same time period, and we're kind of moving through a timeline here. In 1804 is when the Burr versus Hamilton duel occurred. So Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr dueled, and this resulted in Alexander Hamilton's death. He is famous for being the only founding father who did not live into an older age because of this duel. And Thomas Jefferson was then reelected in 1804. So Burr and Hamilton had been political enemies for years. Aaron Burr won a U.S. Senate seat from New York by defeating Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. And as we mentioned in the election of 1800, Alexander Hamilton persuaded congressmen to vote for Thomas Jefferson instead of Aaron Burr for president. And then in 1804, 4 years later, Thomas Jefferson replaced Aaron Burr on the Democratic Republican ticket. And then Burr sought to be elected as governor of New York, and Hamilton shot that down. And basically, this feud between them continued to increase until they challenged each other to a duel. It wasn't uncommon for people to resort to dueling as a way to settle challenges. However, most of the time, shots were never even fired, and they would formally negotiate things on, a matter of honor. However, Hamilton and Alexander Burr did fire at each other. Some argue that Hamilton fired and missed intentionally, and Aaron Burr's shot ruptured Alexander Hamilton's liver, and he died the next day. So that was the death of Alexander Hamilton. And for Aaron Burr, it was also the beginning of the end of his political career, because a lot of people held him responsible for killing Alexander Hamilton, and any popularity and support that he did have was reduced after this event. So then in 1804, Thomas Jefferson is reelected to a second term as president. This election was heavily in his favor. He defeated the opposing political party in every state, with the exception of Connecticut and Delaware. Thomas Jefferson felt like things were going well for him at this time. The Barbary states, the pirates were being controlled. The 12th Amendment had gotten rid of confusion about presidential ties and different presidential and vice presidential candidates. Thomas Jefferson also purchased the Louisiana Territory and sent Lewis and Clark on their westward expedition during this time period. And Thomas Jefferson is famous for the Louisiana Purchase because it doubled the territory of the United States. It doubled the size of the country. And that led to a huge amount of expansion over the coming years. So now we're going to get into Britain versus France. Why? Because it's going to leak over onto U.S. Territory. So Britain and France have been enemies off and on for many centuries, really, and they started a war again between each other in 1803. So this is during Thomas Jefferson's rule, towards the end of the Barbary Pirate War. Wars were being fought against the French ruler Napoleon and his dreams for European empire. Initially, the United States chose to remain neutral and remain out of the war between Britain and France. They wanted to continue to trade with both countries, and we really weren't equipped for another war. So how could remaining neutral be problematic? Because we're sending ships back and forth to both countries, and each country is very angry that we're supporting the other. The British Navy was always in need of sailors, and being a sailor in the British Royal Navy could be so bad that some sailors deserted their ships. And in fact, some of the British sailors deserted their ships and found their way to American ships. And so the British started stopping American ships to see if there were any British deserters on board. and they often took sailors, whether they were British or not, and forced them to serve in the British Navy. This was known as impressment or forced labor because the British Navy was always in need of sailors and was massive. So that led to some conflict between the United States and the British, as you could imagine. The British would wait for American ships outside American ports to try and search them for deserting crew members. In 1807, the British warship called the Leopard did this exact thing to a U.S. ship called the Chesapeake. The captain refused to let the British on board the ship, and the British fired upon them. 3 Americans were killed, and the Chesapeake as a ship was badly damaged. Americans became nearly as mad about this as they had been during the American Revolution. Most American citizens at that time wanted to go to war with Great Britain, but Thomas Jefferson was trying to avoid that. Why? Because we really didn't have the resources to fight another war with the British quite yet. It hadn't really been that long since we fought the last war, and during the original Revolutionary War against the British, we had the support of the French, which now we didn't because there were some tensions with the French as well. So there was very little that President Jefferson could do military-wise in response to what the British were doing because America's small navy was already dealing with the Barbary pirates. So Thomas Jefferson passed a couple of acts. In 1807, the Embargo Act was passed, which banned all imports and exports. And the Non-Intercourse Acts were passed instead to ban trade with Britain, France, and the colonies of both. So we were trying to maintain good trading relationships with both countries, and it was dragging us into the conflict. And so the United States passed acts to just stop trading with both sides in the hope that we would stay out of their conflict between each other. Thomas Jefferson decides not to run for a third presidential term in 1808, following the precedent that George Washington did and stepped down after 2 terms. So James Madison was chosen to run for president by the Republican Party, Charles Pinckney was chosen by the Federalists, and James Madison ended up winning the election. So another president who was the member of the same political party as Thomas Jefferson is taking over. And you can see, according to this map, he won by a landslide, 70% of the vote. Okay, so now James Madison is president, and there's still conflict going on. He takes over the presidency and has to deal with a lot. Britain and France are seizing cargo ships and making money off American ships and products. So in 1810, Congress decides that it's going to lift the embargo on the countries that allow American ships to travel safely. So instead of not trading with anybody, now we're saying we'll trade with whoever doesn't attack us, with the hope that we would stop being attacked. Napoleon of France started to allow Americans to trade again, theoretically and on paper, but still continued to seize ships. And because of this, America felt that it was finally time to fight. However, they weren't sure if we should fight with France against the British or with the British against France. Who is the enemy? Who should we side with? So how did the British feel about the Americans actively trading with the French? Not good, right? So they were very angry. They felt like Americans were trading with the enemy. And this is one thing that led to us fighting the British in the War of 1812. And therefore, because the British didn't want us on our side, we were now leaning towards fighting against Great Britain, another war with the British. And if we were to choose a side, we would side with France. Were we ready for this? Definitely not. However, the Senate voted to declare war, and war was approved, 19 votes to 13. Now, the Federalist Party thought war with Great Britain was a bad idea. Why? The British are too strong. Our army in 1812 was literally nothing. Our navy was a small handful of small ships. There was no national bank to raise money. They had abolished the national bank in 1811 after Alexander Hamilton died. And the French were busy and not on our best side either. So there were no allies. We had to fight this war by ourselves. And one of the reasons why we had won the Revolutionary War was with French support. However, the Federalist Party was outnumbered and outvoted by the Republican or the Democratic Republican Party. And so war was declared in 1812. Hence the name, the War of 1812. So now we're going to talk about this war a little bit. Okay. And we're going to skip over this because let's see. Hold on. Bear with me here. All right. So the capital of the United States had been moved from New York to which location during the beginning of John Adams' presidency? Washington, D.C., of course. Now, during the War of 1812, the American capital was attacked. In 1814, British intended to capture Washington, D.C., and they were pretty successful initially. They quickly defeated the local militia and destroyed the capital and the president's mansion. Washington, D.C. went up in flames. Dolly Madison, the president's wife, stayed in the White House until cannon fire was just miles away and ordered the removal of Washington's portrait from the walls. And she is known to be quoted saying, "Save that picture if possible. If not possible, destroy it. Under no circumstances are you to allow it to fall into the hands of the British." So that's a pretty famous choice that she made. And the top left photo here is that picture. These are some paintings portraying the burning of the American Capitol, the White House, and a huge chunk of the city of Washington, D.C. As a result of this, we actually get the Star-Spangled Banner, or what is now our national anthem. So you may not have known this, but our national anthem wasn't written during the Revolutionary War. It was written during the War of 1812. So the British moved on through Washington, D.C. into Baltimore, Maryland to Fort McHenry. However, that fort successfully defended itself against British attack, and a writer named Francis Scott Key watched the attack from the British ships and wrote a poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry after realizing that they had survived the attack. He set it to music later, or it was set to music later, and became the national anthem. Now, the War of 1812 did not last very long. By the December of 1814, just a couple years later, British and Americans met in a city in Belgium and began setting up the process to create peace and prevent future disputes. So the War of 1812 was a little bit more bluster than a long-lasting war. Each side was so busy dealing with other things. I don't want to say it was a half-hearted war, but it certainly was a faster war. And in the end, nothing really changed. So both sides agreed to the Treaty of Ghent, and in this treaty, which ended the War of 1812, there were no border changes, there was no addressing the impressment or the kidnapping of soldiers off of ships being forced into the British Navy, and there was no addressing the rights of American ships on the seas. So all of the reasons that the war was initially fought were not addressed. They just sort of decided to stop fighting without addressing the problems. Now, that was in December of 1814, and the last battle was fought in January of 1815. Why? Because news travels slowly across the ocean. And so in January 1815, in North America, the U.S. and British met at New Orleans and were still fighting because they didn't know a truce had been negotiated. So Andrew Jackson, fighting for the American side, barricaded his men on the edge of the cities, waited for the redcoats. They hid and took cover, and then mowed down the British when they arrived. So the Battle of New Orleans was a solid American win, and Andrew Jackson became a hero because of this battle, which led to his popularity, and we will talk later, he eventually becomes elected president, and it's partly because of the popularity and fame that he gains as a result of this battle. So that is everything that I have for this lesson. There is an associated quiz that you're going to want to go take, and it is, I think it's called the War of 1812 quiz. Might be something slightly different, but you'll see it in the assignments that are upcoming and due. If you have any questions, send me an email, and I will see you all very soon.